On a spring afternoon in 1894, in a small recording studio in New Jersey, a black man in his late 40s stood in the middle of a room and faced 4 large brass horns. The horns were arranged in a semicircle, each one pointed at his mouth from a slightly different angle. Each horn was connected by a thin metal rod to a wax cylinder turning on a separate machine. There was no microphone, there were no headphones, there was no amplifier, there were no engineers in a control room behind glass because there was no control room and there was no glass. There was a man and there were 4 horns and there were 4 cylinders and there was a song. The song was called The Laughing Song. He wrote it himself. He was about to sing the song full voice into the 4 horns and the 4 cylinders would record what came out of him. When he was done, there would be 4 copies of the song in the world. To make 8 copies, he'd have to sing it again. To make 12 copies, he would have to sing it for a 3rd time. To make 100 copies, he would have to sing it 25 times. There was no other way to do it. The technology of 1894 could record a sound, but it couldn't yet copy that recording, so the recording had to be made again and again by the man who made it the first time. His name was George Washington Johnson. He had been born enslaved in Loudoun County, Virginia, sometime around October of 1846. On that afternoon in 1894, he was the first black recording star in the history of the United States. He was also, unknowingly, in the middle of about a decade of work that would make several record companies a great deal of money and would leave him opening doors for a living when it was over. By January of 1914, George Washington Johnson would die of pneumonia in a rooming house in Harlem. He would be approximately 67 years old. He would be buried in an unmarked pauper's grave in a cemetery in Queens. The only obituary published about him in the leading black newspaper of the period would describe him as an embarrassing relic of another era. By the time he died, the recording industry that had been built on his back had moved on to other singers with better technology and better contracts. None of those singers were paying his rent. The men who had first paid him 20 cents a song at the Hudson River Ferry Terminal were running corporations by then. One of them would go on to found a company that still exists today. You can buy his televisions at any Walmart. This is the story of how the first black recording star in American history made the records that built an industry. It's also the story of how the industry made him, and what happened 12 years later when the technology finally figured out how to copy itself, and the body that was doing the copying was no longer needed. I'm Lorne Bregitzer, a professor at the University of Colorado Denver's College of Arts and Media. And on Everything is Gray, we try to make sense of something that's rarely simple, how the artists we admire and the things they've done shape the way we see their work and ourselves. George Washington Johnson is not in most histories of American popular music. When he is mentioned, he's usually mentioned in a single sentence and then dropped. The Library of Congress added one of his recordings to the National Recording Registry in 2014, which was either 120 years late or right on time, depending on how you count. There's exactly one full-length biography of him, written by a music historian named Tim Brooks, which came out in 2004 as part of a larger book about black artists in the early recording industry. Almost everything I'm going to tell you in this episode is in that book or in a handful of digitized trade journals or newspaper accounts from the 1890s. The reason you've never heard of George Washington Johnson is not that the information is hard to find. The reason is that the story he's in the middle of is one that the American music industry has never been particularly interested in telling about itself. So I'm going to tell it. George Washington Johnson was born in Loudoun County, Virginia, in or around October of 1846. The exact date is uncertain because slave records weren't kept the way records of free people were kept, and the people who would have known the date are gone. What we do know is that he was born to a 15-year-old father named Samuel and a 13-year-old mother named Druana, both of whom were illiterate, both of whom were the property of a prosperous farmer in the area, and neither of them appear in any documentation after the 1860 census. We don't know if he had any siblings. We don't know what his earliest years looked like. We do know that very early on, he was taken from his parents by the white family that owned them and brought into their main house at a farm called Glenmore, where he was made the playmate of the farmer's own son. Let's sit with that fact for a minute. He wasn't free in the legal sense. The Moore family still owned him, but they treated him as a kind of permanent companion to their child. He learned to read and write. He learned to whistle. He developed a singing voice that could stop people on a street by the time he was a teenager. When the Civil War ended and emancipation made his freedom legal, he did what a lot of formerly enslaved black men did in the early 1870s. He went north. The exact year isn't certain. Some sources say 1873 and some say 1876. Either way, by the late 1870s, he was living in New York City in a neighborhood called Hell's Kitchen on the west side of Manhattan, where he was making a living as a street performer. He whistled and he sang. Johnson worked the foot traffic at the Hudson River Ferry Terminal, where commuters were getting on and off the boats that ran between Manhattan and New Jersey. He occasionally got hired to perform at private parties for wealthy New Yorkers, including at least once by a financier named Levi Morton, who would later become the Vice President of the United States. He may have spent a brief stretch touring with a black minstrel troupe called the Georgia Minstrels. Mostly, he stood near a ferry slip and made noise that people would pay a few coins to hear. That's what George Washington Johnson was doing in 1890, when an employee of a company called the New Jersey Phonograph Company walked past him. To understand why that walk-by changed everything, you have to understand what the phonograph was in 1890, which is almost nothing like what you probably picture. Thomas Edison had patented the phonograph in 1877. He recorded a few lines of Mary Had a Little Lamb onto a sheet of tinfoil wrapped around a cylinder. He played it back, showed it off to a magazine in New York, and then he basically dropped the project for a decade to work on the electric light. The reason he dropped it is that the technology as he built it didn't work as a product. The tinfoil was too fragile. The recordings couldn't be removed from the machine without destroying them. You could record your voice once and play it back a few times before the foil tore. It took another decade for the phonograph to become something a customer could actually use. By 1888, Edison was back at it, and wax cylinders had replaced the tinfoil, and the recordings could be played back dozens of times before they wore out, but there was still no obvious way to sell it. Nobody wanted to buy a phonograph for the house, partly because nobody could afford one, and partly because there was almost nothing to play on it. The cylinders were blank. The breakthrough wasn't technological. The breakthrough was commercial. On November 23, 1889, an inventor named Louis Glass installed one of Edison's machines in a saloon on Sutter Street in San Francisco, inside a beautiful oak cabinet, with 4 rubber tubes coming out the front that customers stuck in their ears. They paid a nickel to listen for a few minutes. The amplification was so bad that tubes were necessary. There was a handkerchief hanging on the side of the cabinet for wiping the earpieces. Gross, but it became a sensation. Within 18 months, Glass had 13 of these machines in saloons, restaurants, and ferries around the Bay Area, and they had taken in around $4,000 in nickels, which is about $100,000 today. The coin-in-the-slot phonograph parlor was born. What the parlor needed was content. Specifically, it needed loud content, because the playback was so quiet that anything subtle was lost in the rubber tubes. It needed short content because the cylinders held about 2 minutes of audio. It needed cheap content because the labels were going to pay performers per cylinder and they wanted to keep that price low. It also needed performers who could deliver the same song over and over without complaining, because every single cylinder had to be recorded individually by a human being. In 1890, a part-time employee of the New Jersey Phonograph Company named Victor Emerson was sent out to find performers who fit the bill. He walked down to the Hudson River Ferry Terminal one afternoon. He heard a black man in his 40s singing and whistling for coins. He offered him 20 cents a song. That was the day the deal was made. He took the 20 cents. A few weeks later, George Washington Johnson was standing in a small recording studio in New Jersey, facing a setup he'd never seen before, doing a job that nobody in human history had ever done. The room was not what you picture when you hear the word studio. There were no microphones, because microphones for sound recording wouldn't exist for another 30 years. There were no headphones, because headphones didn't exist either. There was no soundproofing, because the room was used to capture the sound, not block it out. There were no engineers behind glass making decisions about levels, as there were no levels to be set. What there was in 1890 was a row of 3 or 4 large brass horns mounted on wooden stands. Each horn pointed at the spot where the performer was supposed to stand. Behind each horn, at the back of the funnel, was a thin metal disc about the size of a silver dollar, called a diaphragm, connected to a metal stylus. Underneath each stylus was a wax cylinder turning a spring motor. That was it. That was the recording studio. The way it worked was simple and exhausting. Johnson stood in front of the horns and sang. His voice traveled down the throat of each horn, vibrated the diaphragm at the bottom, drove the stylus, and the stylus cut a groove into the soft wax of the cylinder. When the song was over, the engineers stopped the motors, took the 4 cylinders off the machines, put 4 new blank cylinders on, started the motors again, and Johnson sang the song once again, and then again, and again. That was the day's work. He sang the same song, full voice, into 4 horns 20 times. Think about that for a second. Singing once at full volume into a brass funnel 6 inches from your face is one thing. Doing it 20 times in a row with barely a pause between takes, while keeping your pitch precise, your timing identical, and your performance bright enough that the playback won't sound dead through a rubber tube stuck in some saloon goer's ear 2,000 miles away, is another thing entirely. And then the engineers swap in cylinders for the next song, and you do it again. By the end of the 8-hour day, Johnson had performed 20 rounds of 3 different songs and produced something like 240 finished cylinders. He was paid $4 for the day, about $150 today. For a freed slave, this is an amazing amount of money at the time. That's the math you need to hold in your head for the rest of this story. 20 cents per song per round, no matter how many cylinders the round produced. The labels arranged the horns in semicircles around them specifically so they could squeeze 3 or 4 cylinders out of every performance. Every cylinder they pressed off Johnson's voice was a cylinder they could sell to a phonograph parlor that would resell it for nickels in 100 listens. Johnson got paid for the labor, and the labels kept the cylinders. And there was no other way to do it. In 1890, there was no master recording you could press copies from. There was no negative you could strike prints off. There was no tape you could dub. Each cylinder existed by itself, as a physical artifact that was produced, in real time, by a human being singing into a brass horn. If a saloon in Cleveland wanted 100 copies of a song, somebody had to sing that song 25 times to make 100 cylinders. And usually that somebody was Johnson. He was also, at the same time he was recording for the New Jersey Phonograph Company, recording for a competing label called New York Phonograph Company. He'd do a session in New Jersey in the morning and a session in Manhattan in the afternoon. Both labels paid him per round. Both labels owned the cylinders. He had no contract with either of them in a meaningful way. There was no royalty arrangement. He had no publishing arrangement. He didn't even own most of the songs he was recording. When he started writing his own material a few years later, he didn't own those either, because the labels paid him for the performance, and the performance was the product. The composition was almost an afterthought. In the first 6 months of doing this work, Johnson made about $55, which is about $1,500 today. By the standards of what the average black man in 1890 New York could expect to earn, that was good money. By the standards of what the labels were making off the cylinders he was producing, it was nothing. The first stars of the American recording industry weren't stars in the sense we use the word now. They were duplication machines made out of human bodies. And the next question, the one that would shape Johnson's entire recording career, was a simple one. What were those human bodies going to be made to sing? The answer was coon songs. If that phrase is new to you, think about how ugly it is before I tell you anything else. The word is exactly what it sounds like. I'd also like to apologize for my usage of the word here, but it's important to be accurate with the ugliness of it all. The genre is what it sounds like you would imagine, the audio version of a minstrel show. Coon songs were the most popular form of American music in the 1890s. They were sold by every major sheet music publisher in the country, sung by white performers in blackface in vaudeville theaters from Maine to California. They consisted almost entirely of caricatures of black people designed to entertain white audiences. The titles tell you most of what you need to know. All coons look like me. Coon, coon, coon. If the Man in the Moon Were a Coon. Those are real songs that sold in real numbers to real people who took them home and sang them around the piano in the parlor. If you think those are bad, I'm not even mentioning the titles of the songs that I wouldn't dare to say. This was the scene of the 1890s American pop music. And when the phonograph industry was figuring out what it could sell, coon songs were the most reliable answer it had. So when Victor Emerson walked Johnson into the New Jersey studio for the first time, the song he asked him to record was a coon song. The most famous one, which was called The Whistling Coon, it was written 2 years earlier by a white minstrel performer named Sam DeVere. The cylinder was a hit, which sounds awkward to say and hear. Two things are true about the recording. The first is that the song was a piece of racist garbage written by a white man for white audiences, and Johnson, a black man, was being paid 20 cents per round to perform it. The second is that his actual performance of it was noticeably more restrained than the white blackface performer singing the same material in the minstrel show circuits. The music historians who actually listened to the recordings agree on that. He didn't lay the dialect on as thick, and he didn't push the caricature. He sang it like a street singer because that's what he was. He had a craftsman's sense of what worked. That distinction doesn't redeem the song. It's not the kind of thing that gets a black performer in 1891 off the hook for participating in his own caricature, but it's the distinction the recording itself makes when you actually put it on. And it gets erased completely when the story is told, either as the noble black artist subverting the form or as the complicit black artist selling out his community. Both are a cleaner version than what was actually happening, which was a man with a good voice who took any work that was available, and this is what he was best at. In 1894, Johnson wrote and recorded his own song. This one was called The Laughing Song. The concept was simple. He sang a short verse about hearing some piece of unspecified gossip, and then he laughed. The laugh was the song. It was a loud and sustained, rhythmically precise kind of song a cylinder could capture, and a rubber tube in a saloon could play back with maximum impact. The Laughing Song became, by some estimates, the best-selling cylinder of the entire 1890s. 10,000 copies. Johnson didn't own any of them. He wrote the song, he performed the song, and the labels paid him 20 cents per round to do both. After that, the song belonged to them. By the mid-1890s, while Johnson was still in front of the horns recording his own hits for the New Jersey Phonograph Company, a white performer named Len Spencer was recording the same songs, in the same style, for the competing Columbia Phonograph Company. Yes, that Columbia that would become Columbia Records that today is part of Sony. The Spencer covers sold well. They were marketed without anyone needing to mention that the originals were performed by a black man. The labels were happy to have both versions in the catalog, because the white version sold to one customer and the black version sold to another, and the labels were paying both performers per round. Now I want to skip ahead with you for a minute because this is the same thing that repeats over the next century. In 1955, the singer Pat Boone recorded a song called Tutti Frutti. A black man named Little Richard had written and performed it. He released it that same year on a small label called Specialty Records. Pat Boone's version was slower, smoother, less wild, and aimed at white audience who wouldn't have bought a record by Little Richard. It sold more than the original. Little Richard, who owned the publishing on the song, said for the rest of his life that Pat Boone's cover of Tutti Frutti paid for his swimming pool, as we mentioned a few episodes ago. He also said more bitterly that it took Pat Boone's version for white America to discover his song. That pattern didn't start with Pat Boone. It didn't start with Elvis. It didn't start with the British invasion. It started in 1890 in a small studio in New Jersey with George Washington Johnson singing into a row of brass horns. Pat Boone wasn't the inventor of that move. He was one of many over the previous and following decades. Johnson was the original artist whose songs were watered down and popularized by white artists for audiences who preferred their music segregated. There's one more piece of this story I want to get into before we move on. The reason pop songs today are about 3 minutes long is the wax cylinder. The cylinders Johnson recorded onto held about 2 minutes of audio. The discs that replaced cylinders in the early 20th century held about 3 minutes. The form of the popular song was shaped by the storage capacity of a piece of wax that Johnson sang into 130 years ago. Every time somebody today complains that Spotify is making songs shorter, they're complaining about the contraction of a form whose original length was set by the duration of a cylinder spinning in a studio in 1890. By 1899, Johnson was at the peak of his career. He had hits in 2 genres. He was being recorded by every major label in the country. He had real money for the first time in his life. He was the most successful black recording artist in the 19th century. He was one of the most successful recording artists of that century period, at least as far as record label sales were concerned. He was also completely exposed. October 12, 1899. George Washington Johnson came home to his apartment in Manhattan one afternoon and found his common-law wife, a woman named Roskin Stewart, beaten and unconscious. She didn't wake up. She wound up passing away a few hours later. What we know about Roskin Stewart is almost nothing. She was a light-skinned black woman. She'd been living with Johnson since 1896. They were together in everything, only without a marriage license. No photo of her can be found. No description of her personality survives. We don't know what she did for a living, or what brought her to Johnson, or what they fought about, because they did fight. This is the unfortunate circumstance of many black people in the 19th century. The people who would have known the answers are long since gone. What we do know is on the afternoon of October 12, 1899, somebody beat her badly enough to put her on the floor of the apartment the couple shared, and a few hours later she was dead. We don't know who, and we don't know why. Forensic medicine in 1899 was not what it would later become, so we genuinely don't know. What we do know is what happened next. Johnson was arrested that evening and charged with her murder. The press came quickly. Within 24 hours, the New York Herald, the World, the Times, and the rest of the major daily newspapers were running the story on the front page. The headlines were variations on a theme: Whistling Coon on trial, the laughing singer in the dock. They ran Johnson's picture. They referred to him by his stage name as often by his real one. They wrote about him the same way they wrote about a vaudeville act that took a strange turn. The fact that a woman had died, secondary to the spectacle of his being involved. Roskin Stewart's name appears in some of the coverage. In a lot of it, it doesn't. The black press handled the story differently. The leading black newspaper in New York, the New York Age, covered the case only briefly and without enthusiasm. Some historians have suggested that the Age and other black papers were quietly relieved that Johnson, whose recording career had embarrassed some black readers from the beginning, might finally be off the public stage. Others suggested that they simply didn't have the resources to cover a sensationalized trial in papers they had no interest in echoing. The answer is probably both. What we do know is that almost immediately after Johnson's arrest, the recording industry rallied around him in a way that nobody could have predicted from how it had treated him every other day in his career. Victor Emerson, the man who walked Johnson into the studio 9 years earlier, personally raised about $1,000 for his legal defense. Other supporters in the recording business raised another $1,000 on top of that. The total defense fund came to about $2,000, which is around $75,000 today. That's a lot of money for a man whose recording arrangement had no royalties, no contract, and no obligation of any kind from the labels who owned his masters. So why did they do that? I want to be honest about this. The romantic answer is that the men who'd worked with Johnson genuinely liked him and believed he was innocent. That answer might be partly true. The less romantic answer is that Johnson in 1899 was still selling tens of thousands of cylinders a year for the labels that owned his masters. And the recording industry in 1899 couldn't create a copy of a cylinder mechanically, which meant that if Johnson went to prison or the gallows, the labels lost access to the only person who could record fresh cylinders of his hits. The defense fund could have been a capital investment. The trial began on December 20th, 1899. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial. There was no murder weapon. There was no eyewitness. The medical examiner couldn't say with confidence that the head injury had been caused by another person, or that her death was the direct result of the beating rather than something else. Johnson didn't testify. His defense, paid for by Emerson's fund, focused on two things. The first was the weakness of the prosecution's evidence. The second was the character of Roskin Stewart. The defense brought witnesses who testified that Stewart had a history of violent fights, heavy drinking, and injuries from sources other than Johnson. They painted her, using the language of the day, as a woman of disreputable habits. The prosecution, which had little to work with on the medical evidence, had even less to work with on the question of her credibility, because she was dead and she couldn't defend herself. Stop here for a second, because if you've been listening to this show for a while, this playbook should sound familiar. 22 years later, in a hotel room in San Francisco, a different woman would die under contested circumstances in a room with a different famous entertainer. The defense in that case would use the same strategy, almost line for line. Establish the weakness of the medical evidence, attack the character of the dead woman. The dead woman in that case was Virginia Rapé. The famous entertainer was Roscoe Arbuckle from episode 1 of this season. The defense attorneys in San Francisco, 2 decades later, didn't invent the move. They inherited it. In Johnson's case, the strategy worked. After a series of objections and a string of unsuccessful prosecution motions, the district attorney moved to drop all charges. The judge granted the motion. Johnson walked out of the courthouse a free man. A few days later, he was back in a New Jersey studio, recording cylinders. He was alive and he was free, and he had his job. He was back in front of the horns at the labels that had funded his acquittal. And Roskin Stewart, in the historical record, gets about 1 paragraph. 3 years. That's how much time Johnson had left. In December of 1899, the labels rallied around him because they had to. Without him, the cylinders of the Whistling Coon and the Laughing Song couldn't be replenished. The masters in the company vaults were the only masters that existed. If those wore out, or if demand outpaced what was on hand, somebody had to record fresh ones. And the person who could do it was sitting in a Manhattan courthouse waiting to be tried for murder. By the end of 1902, none of that would be true anymore. The labels had a problem they'd been trying to solve for almost a decade. The entire business model of the recording industry depended on a man like Johnson being willing to stand in front of 4 brass horns and sing the same song over and over until the floor was littered with finished cylinders. The recording sessions were extraordinarily inefficient. Every cylinder cost real money to produce, and the cost of paying performers for every session was the biggest expense on the ledger. What the labels wanted was simple. They wanted to record a song once, the way you take a photograph once, and then make copies forever. By 1902, they had 2 ways to do it. The first was an Edison process called gold-molded cylinder duplication, which used an electroplated metal mold to stamp out wax copies from a single master. The copies were almost as good as the original. The process was fast, and you could produce hundreds of copies from a single master. The second breakthrough was happening on a completely different format. A German-born inventor named Emil Berliner had spent the 1890s developing a flat disc to replace the cylinder. Discs could be pressed in stampers the way you press a coin. Berliner's company, which would soon become the Victor Talking Machine Company and eventually RCA Victor, was about to make discs the standard of the recording industry. Every Victor disc that came off a press was a copy from a single original master. By the end of 1902, the labels could record George Washington Johnson singing the Laughing Song one time and then make 10,000 copies of that recording without him being in the building. The music historian Tim Brooks, who wrote the most complete biography we have of Johnson, describes what happened next in a single sentence. Once the companies had secured a suitable master recording from him, they didn't need him anymore, and his income dropped precipitously. Johnson didn't get fired, there was no meeting, there wasn't a letter, there was no severance, there was simply a slow tapering off of the work, a gradual reduction in the number of sessions he was called in for, a diminishing list of new songs the labels wanted from him. He was still allowed to come into the studio. The labels were still happy to record him when they needed a fresh master of something, but the daily grind of recording the same songs over and over, the work that was paying him $4 a day, 6 days a week was gone. Johnson didn't fail. He wasn't outsold. He wasn't pushed out by some new singer with a fresher sound. He was made structurally obsolete by the very technology he'd spent 12 years making profitable. The machinery that had created him couldn't copy itself. He'd had a paycheck for one reason: the machine couldn't copy itself. The minute it could, the paycheck was gone. This really wasn't a story about technology making a worker obsolete. It was a story about the deal the recording industry was going to offer black artists for the next 60 years. The labels owned the masters. The artists owned the labor. The masters stayed in the catalog forever. The artists eventually did not. Johnson had no royalties to fall back on because royalties hadn't been invented yet. He had no savings to speak of because the labels paid him as a laborer, and he spent like a man who expected the labor to continue. In 1903, Johnson recorded a few new cylinders. In 1904, fewer. In 1905, fewer still. By 1908, the man who'd been the highest paid black recording artist in America was mostly working as a doorman. The man who hired him was Len Spencer. Think about that for a second. Len Spencer was the white performer who was recording covers of Johnson's hits at Columbia for 15 years. By 1908, Spencer had moved beyond performing and was running a theatrical booking agency in Midtown Manhattan. He needed somebody to greet the talent, take their hats, and escort them to the meeting room. Spencer gave the job to George Washington Johnson. The uniform was an admiral's outfit, white cap with brass buttons and a formal coat. Johnson stood at the door of Spencer's office 6 days a week, in his costume, greeting the agents and performers as they came in. It would be easy to call this cruel, but it probably wasn't. By every account, Spencer and Johnson were friendly. Spencer was a generous employer, by the standards of the white men in the recording industry in 1908. He knew Johnson personally and paid him on time. He may genuinely have hired Johnson because he was worried about a friend with no other options. It's likely that he did. The cruelty is in the industry and not the men in this case. The Spencer covers of Johnson's songs were still in the Columbia catalog, generating revenue for him. Spencer was probably still receiving small payments on those records. Johnson was receiving nothing on the records he'd recorded, because Johnson had never been entitled to anything past his session fee. The industry was working as designed. The men weren't the recording industry, but they benefited from it in proportion to how much it decided they were worth. Johnson kept the job for the next several years and he drank heavily. He developed heart problems. He went to fewer studio sessions and then almost none. By 1912, he was no longer being called in for recordings at all. By January of 1914, he was living in a rooming house in Harlem, sick, broke, and alone. He wound up passing away on January 23, 1914. The cause of death was bronchopneumonia and chronic myocarditis. He was approximately 67 years old, though his exact age was never known, because nobody kept careful records of black people at the time. His body was buried in Maple Grove Cemetery in Queens, in an unmarked grave that the city paid for because Johnson hadn't left enough money to pay for it himself. The leading black newspaper in New York, the New York Age, ran an obituary. It was about 3 sentences long. The Age treated his death as a footnote, describing him as an embarrassing relic of another era, and then moved on. It was the only obituary that ran. The white papers, which had given him front-page coverage during his trial in 1899, didn't cover his death at all. In December of 1914, 11 months after Johnson's death, Len Spencer died of a heart attack in Manhattan. Spencer's obituary was much longer than Johnson's. It ran in multiple papers and described him as a respectable figure in the recording industry. And Victor Emerson, the man who walked Johnson into his first studio in 1890 and personally raised $1,000 for his defense in 1899, went on to found a company called Emerson Radio. That company is still in business today. You can buy its televisions at any Walmart. Let's do the accounting. The record industry got a great deal out of George Washington Johnson. It got the first commercially successful records in American history. Before Johnson, the phonograph was a novelty looking for a product. After Johnson, it was a business with a hit song. The Laughing Song sold tens of thousands of copies in a decade when selling 1,000 of anything was remarkable, and it proved that records were something people would buy again and again. It got the blueprint. The arrangement the labels worked out with Johnson became the model for the next 60 years. Find a black performer with a voice that records well, pay him a flat fee per session, keep the masters, and then owe him nothing afterward. Bessie Smith got a similar version of that deal in the 1920s. Chuck Berry got a version of it in the 1950s. The specific terms shifted from artist to artist. The basic shape didn't. The label keeps the catalog, the artist keeps the session fee, and when the artist stops being useful, the catalog stays and the artist goes. It got the white cover. Len Spencer recording Johnson's songs at Columbia in the 1890s is the same thing as Pat Boone recording Little Richard in the 1950s. The labels ran that move on black artists for the entire 20th century because it worked, because white audiences would buy a white version of a black song and the labels collected on both. And it got the 3-minute song, which is still the standard today. Here's what George Washington Johnson got. In his best 6 months, he made about $1,500 in today's money. He got a few good years after that. He got a defense fund when the labels needed him alive and recording. He got a doorman's uniform when they didn't. Johnson got a rooming house in Harlem, a city-funded grave with no marker, and a 3-sentence obituary that called him an embarrassment. The technology of recorded music has been replaced 5 times since Johnson stood in front of those horns. Wax cylinder to shellac disc, to magnetic tape, to digital files, to streaming. Each replacement was sold as a revolution. Each one made it cheaper and easier to copy a recording, and harder for the person who made the recording to get paid for it. The machine that George Washington Johnson sang into has been improved beyond recognition. The deal he was offered has barely changed at all. And for almost 100 years after he died in that rooming house, the deal worked exactly as designed. George Washington Johnson was forgotten, not by accident, by the ordinary functioning of a business that got everything it needed from him and had no reason left to remember his name. Then, 100 years after his death, somebody remembered. In 2014, the Library of Congress added the laughing song to the National Recording Registry. The registry is the federal government's official list of recordings worth preserving forever. To make it, a recording has to be at least 10 years old and has to be judged, in the language of the statute, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The library adds about 25 recordings a year. By 2014, the list included Louis Armstrong, Aretha Franklin, the moon landing broadcast, and a recording of George Washington Johnson laughing into a horn for a nickel's worth of entertainment in 1894. All 3 of the library's criteria apply to the laughing song, and it's worth taking them one at a time. It's culturally significant because it was one of the best-selling recordings of the entire decade that invented the best-selling record. Tens of thousands of Americans heard George Washington Johnson's voice before they heard almost any recorded voice at all. For a lot of people, he was the first sound that ever came out of a machine. It's historically significant because he was the first black recording star in American history, and because the way the industry used him and discarded him set the pattern for how it would treat black artists for the next 60 years. It's aesthetically significant because the man could actually sing and whistle and laugh on cue with a control that the recording engineers of 1894 could barely capture, and that still comes through on surviving cylinders today. And there's a 4th thing about the laughing song that the library's 3 words don't quite cover. It's a recording of a black man laughing, on demand, into a brass horn, while performing a song built on a genre designed to make white audiences comfortable with the idea of what a black man was. He laughed because the laugh was the product. He laughed because the labels could sell the laugh. He laughed 20 times a day into 4 horns at a time for 20 cents a round. And the laughing is what made it onto the National Recording Registry 120 years later. 2 things can be true at the same time. The laughing song is a genuine landmark of American recorded music, worth preserving forever, sung by a man with a real and rare gift. And it's the sound of George Washington Johnson doing the only work the country would pay him to do. In a voice the industry owned and a human body the industry used until the technology made the body unnecessary. We don't know exactly when he was born. We don't know exactly how old he was when he died. We don't know what Roskin Stewart looked like, or what the 2 of them fought about, or what happened in that apartment on the afternoon she died. We don't know where in Maple Grove Cemetery his unmarked grave actually is. The record is full of holes, and the holes are not an accident. Nobody kept careful records of the lives of black people born into slavery in 1846. And nobody felt much need to keep them when those people died poor in 1914. The silence around George Washington Johnson is not a gap in the story. The silence is the story. But we have the laugh. The laugh survived. It survived the wax wearing out and the labels losing interest, and the man being forgotten for the better part of a century. You can pull it up right now, on the phone in your pocket, on a streaming service that pays a fraction of a cent per play to whoever currently owns the rights, which is not, and never was, George Washington Johnson. Put it on sometime. It's a man laughing 130 years ago because somebody was paying him to. It's one of the first things a machine ever taught itself to copy, and it's the only piece of him that the country he sang for decided was worth keeping. I'm Lorne with Everything is Gray. Thanks for listening. This episode is dedicated to George Washington Johnson, who made the records, and to Roskin Stewart, who didn't even get a paragraph. This episode was written, edited, and performed by Lorne Bregitzer.